Well, welcome everyone. Glad you could join us today to talk about, well, the status of Kootenay Lake and I guess the recent fishery recovery efforts, which I know really is something that we all highly value. My name is Matt Neufeld. I'm the Fish and Aquatic Habitat Section Head for the province and the Kootenay Boundary Region. And I'm joined today by a team from across the province that have been involved in Kootenay Lake recovery actions. I guess as you all know, like the last several years have really challenged us in a bunch of ways, and getting together to share information has really been one of those key challenges. So we recognize these, and I guess we're hoping to do a better job of this moving forward. Right now, what you're watching, this is a virtual opportunity. Of course, we also are hoping and looking forward to doing a better job of this in the future, and doing this in person if feasible. So I thought before we get going today, first I'd talk quickly a bit about the format for this event. And so one, the recording here that you're watching, the presentation now, we hope will give you a good feel for the issues, where we're at with solving them and some of the future plan, as well as an opportunity to digest some of the information and identify questions that you might have. At the end of this presentation and on our website, there's a link to a survey, which once you've watched this will allow you to ask questions between now and our virtual in-person meeting, and also a link to a survey, which will help, a questionnaire, which is going to help us improve future actions and hear from you. Second part of this takes place on March 14th at 7 p.m. Which this team, the one you see here today, will join you virtually after you've heard this recording for about an hour and a half, 7 to 8:30, in a Zoom meeting format, really focused on question and answers. These are things we hear, we'll hear from your response to the questionnaire, but also there'll be an opportunity for you to bring forward questions at that Monday meeting. So that's maybe enough for me to start, I guess, to set the stage. Maybe I'll turn this over to our team to introduce ourselves and then start working through the information that we want to share today. So pass it on to you, Marley.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. My name is Marley Bassett. I work for the provincial government with the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program section, and I coordinate and deliver the nutrient restoration programs. I'll hand it over to Molly.
Hi everyone, my name is Molly Tether. I'm a fish biologist with Ministry of Forest Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development in Nelson. Most of my time is spent towards Kootenay Lake recovery right now. Tyler?
Hi everyone, I'm Tyler Weir with the province. I'm based in Victoria, the Fish and Aquatic Habitat branch, and my group conducts the hydroacoustic surveys of Kootenay Lake and other large lakes and reservoirs around the province. Will?
I'm Will Warnock. I work with the Fish and Aquatic Habitat team out of the Kootenay region. I actually work out of Cranbrook, and I do a lot of the kind of data analysis and writing up reports about a lot of our fish resources, and in particular in recent memory in Kootenay Lake.
Hi folks, my name is Jeff Burrows. I'm the senior fish biologist for the province in the Kootenays, and I'm working here in Nelson.
Okay, thanks everyone. I guess it's probably a good time to just move into our presentation here today, and I'll turn it over to you, Molly.
Great, thanks, Matt. All right, so before we start, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are speaking on the territory of the Chinook Nation and people, as well as the Salishan speaking peoples. Salishan refers to the language grouping that includes the Okanagan, the Syilx people, the Sinites, and the Secwepemc people. So during today's presentation, we'll talk about the following. We'll discuss the cause for the Kootenay Lake collapse, present the current status of fish stocks in Kootenay Lake, including kokanee, rainbow trout, and bull trout. We'll review the Kootenay Lake recovery actions implemented to date, as well as ongoing monitoring. We'll present our proposed actions for Kootenay Lake recovery for the 2022-2023 season. And then finally, we'll discuss the approach for the upcoming online public meeting, as well as give you the opportunity to be heard by submitted questions that will be answered during the public meeting, as well as giving you the opportunity to answer questions on a survey.
Okay, so if you're tuning in to this presentation, you know it's about the Kokanee Collapse in Kootenay Lake. So this initially happened between 2012 and 2014, culminating in very poor spawner returns of kokanee. We have strong evidence that this initial collapse was caused by overabundant predators. So these are the Girard rainbow trout in the lake and bull trout. So this is what caused the collapse. It's also what has maintained kokanee in a collapse state ever since. So kokanee continue to be very low abundance in the lake, very low spawner abundance. So Kootenay Lake has essentially flipped over to a different stable state in its ecosystem where kokanee abundance is very low and predators remain abundant. There is complete scientific consensus on this view of what occurred and what is keeping kokanee in a collapsed state. And we recently published a paper on this in a leading scientific journal. So what is the main evidence for this? We have multiple independent lines of evidence that suggest that it was predators that caused the collapse. But how we proved it and how we have the strongest evidence for this is by combining a lot of our different information in monitoring the fish populations. We have a tool called a bioenergetics model that allows us to combine data on what predators are eating, how they're growing, how abundant they are, among other factors. And we can use that data to calculate what the total consumption demand is of that population. And we can go back in the past and say in any given year, how many kokanee did that predator population have to eat? So the graph on the bottom right is showing how much the predator population's consumption demand is on kokanee relative to the amount of kokanee prey in the lake, which we can also measure. We do this through hydroacoustic surveys, which Tyler will talk about later. So if we look in those kind of gray zones before 2009, what we found was that predators consumed a relatively small proportion of the total kokanee prey supply in the lake. It varied, it went up and down, but it was always a fairly low proportion. So essentially, there was more kokanee available than predators could possibly eat. Predators were basically satiated by kokanee. Something changed in 2011, where predators became very abundant. And if you look at that data point in the kind of dark gray shading, in 2011, they ate most of the kokanee supply in the lake, leading to an imminent collapse over the next few years. But since then, kokanee have continued to be predated upon and at a very high rate. So the consumption demand of the predator population remains high relative to the supply of kokanee in the lake. So that begs the question, if predators caused the collapse, what caused predators to become overabundant in the first place? That's something that's not as clear, although we understand the mechanism is predators becoming abundant. We don't fully understand the mechanisms that cause those predators to become abundant in the first place. And our best hypotheses at this point is that it was a perfect storm of events that maybe are unlikely to occur in and of themselves. Things like strong recruitment of Girard rainbow trout, strong recruitment of kokanee, good weather that leads to high kokanee growth and survival. A bunch of these things seem to line up in perfect sequence to one another that eventually led to a runaway predation pressure building up, and Girard rainbow trout especially, as well as bull trout, becoming very abundant relative to the kokanee prey supply. Just move on to the next slide.
So we've prepared 3 slides to relate to you the current status of kokanee, starting with a context slide of pre-collapse spawner abundance. So most of the kokanee spawners in the main lake are in 3 sites: the Meadow Creek spawning channel, Meadow Creek, and the Lardo River. And this graph here shows the main lake total kokanee spawner numbers summed over those 3 sites in a pre-collapse sort of natural abundance. And so on the horizontal axis, you have the year. The first data point is 1979 up until 2011. And on the vertical or y-axis is the spawner number. And the axis goes from 0 spawners up to 2.5 million. And the take-home points here for this pre-collapse state is that kokanee vary in abundance, the number of spawners varying in this period of time from 300,000 up to 2.4 million. So 8-fold or 800% natural variation over this period of time, and that over this period of time, the average and median are very similar at 1 million spawners. So the natural state of kokanee spawner numbers for Kootenay Lake ranges and varies a lot, but the average is 1 million, and it can be higher and lower. So then in 2012, very rapidly, this is the same spawner number, spawner sites versus year as a previous pre-collapse slide, but this now shows the rapid collapse that Will mentioned over 3 years. So from 1.7 million spawners all the way down to in 2015, the lower right red point looks like 0, but it's actually 18,000. It looks like 0 on a scale up to 2.5 million. So it happened really fast and is unprecedented and well below the pre-collapse natural minimum of 300,000 kokanee spawners. And then finally, we have the current status now in the collapsed with a D state after the collapse from 2015. So we've had 7, and this year would be the 8th year of sustained low kokanee abundance, ranging from 12 or 13,000 to 90,000 spawners. All of these spawner numbers for 8 years, well below the pre-collapse natural minimum of 300,000, and of course the pre-collapse natural average or median of 1 million spawners.
So I'll speak to this one. So the hydroacoustic surveys are conducted once per year in September. So the spawners have left at that point, and we measure the abundance of the age 0 and older age class kokanee in the reservoir, or in the lake, I should say. So the top figure there is the in-lake kokanee abundance estimate time series for age 0 and age 1 to 3. So you can see the fry population varied quite a bit prior to the collapse, post-collapse period. And since then it's averaged, or it's hovered between 5 and 15 million. In 2021, though, we had a pretty good, strong cohort of fry, and it was 17 million, which is near the long-term average for the entire time series. So that's some good news, but the age 1 to 3 abundance remained at less than 1 million, where it's been since 2013. And kokanee survival, so we can estimate egg to fall fry survival, and I haven't shown that here, but that's been very good since the, been well above average since the kokanee collapse. The bottleneck for kokanee survival, as you can see in that middle figure there, that's the survival of kokanee at age 0 in the fall to the next fall at age 1. So it's every cohort survival over that period of a year. You can see starting in 2012, it dropped to a very low level, and since then it's remained that low at around about 7% on average. And 1 to 2 survival has been variable in this collapse period as well, but there's been a few years where it's improved, including 2021, where it approaches the long-term average for survival from age 1 to age 2. So we can forecast spawner returns for the subsequent year, and our 2021 acoustic survey suggests that in 2022, the fall of 2022, we're likely to see around 60,000 spawners. So that's up from the return in 2021, which was very low, but it's still, as you saw in those previous slides, it's well below the post-collapse period. So there's a basis for recovery with the strong cohort of fry in 2021. But we need to see improvement in the age 0 to 1 survival before it will translate to older kokanee and eventually spawners.
So I'm going to spend a couple slides talking about the 2 predator populations in the lake. So we've covered kokanee. So next we'll move to rainbow trout. I'm going to talk about Girard rainbow trout. There's actually 2 different forms of rainbow trout in Kootenay Lake. There's a form that never gets above 50 centimeters. They typically max out around 45 centimeters, 40 centimeters, so that 16 to 18 inch size range. The ones that get big are a unique ecotype of rainbow trout. They spawn at the outlet of the Lardo River. They're very unique range wide in across the native range of rainbow trout, and they eat kokanee. Their life is tied to eating kokanee, and that's why they get big. That's why these fish are special in Kootenay Lake. And they've been monitored for a long time. That graph on the top right there shows you the spawner numbers at that site at the outlet of Trout Lake in the Lardo River. So historically, they tended to bounce around 500 spawners on average. We saw that kind of runaway event in the late 2000s, early 2010s, which was characterized by very, very abundant Girard rainbow trout in the lake, also on spawning grounds. So we saw unprecedented high levels of Girard rainbow trout spawners. And then when the kokanee collapsed, so did the spawner abundance of rainbow trout. Not nearly as dramatically, though. They went down to relatively low spawner abundance. But in the years since collapse, the spawner abundance has not been what we would consider really concerning from a conservation standpoint. So they're above conservation threshold that we've outlined of about 50 to 100 spawners. So they remain, the spawner abundance is not concerning for rainbow trout. Interestingly, although spawner abundance declined, that doesn't seem to be what's happening in the lake. Actually, in the lake, it seems like abundance has actually increased since the collapse of kokanee. If you look in that graph on the very bottom left, this is tracing what the catch is in our Kootenay Lake fishery. We collect this data by a survey of anglers that goes out to anglers that purchase the conservation surcharge license for Kootenay Lake rainbow trout. So that allows us to track how basically how well anglers are doing for the catch rates of rainbow trout. So we saw during that time period around 2010, abundance seemed to increase. We had increased catch, but since the Kokanee collapse, it actually increased even further. So it seemed like since the Kokanee collapse, we have more rainbow trout in the lake for whatever reason. Now, how could this be so? If you took the main food away from rainbow trout that depend on kokanee, how come they survive so well? How come they're able to still persist despite that collapse in their prey? So fish aren't like mammals. It's not like this, classic predator-prey cycle you might see in something like snowshoe hares and lynx. Fish can adjust their growth, so they can get by with less. So that's what's happened. Rainbow trout don't grow as big. They can make do with less kokanee in the lake. They can also switch to other food resources and sort of adjust their diet downwards so that they don't starve to death. They're still able to survive, but they simply adjust their growth and food intake. Now, what's happened since the collapse, though, is we have started to see a bit of a decline in rainbow trout abundance, especially as of 2021. So this kind of hot off the press current status of rainbow trout is that they seem to be declining in the lake relative to kind of the average that we've seen since the Kokanee collapse. Most of the information that we have on that is from a test fishery. So we do have a research program where there's someone out fishing in the lake in a boat. They use standardized methods. We have them go out every month, and we're able to kind of use these standardized fishing methods to look at all sorts of metrics that are helpful to understand what's going on with the rainbow trout population. One of those is simply their catch. So if you look at that graph on the bottom right there, rainbow trout catch was pretty stable. In fact, it mirrored up until 2018 what was going on in the public fishery. In fact, it increased a little as of 2019, and then it's declined since then. So abundance seems to be declining. We also see telltale signs that this is a fishery effect. The fish that remain in the catch are smaller and they're younger. So if they're younger, it means usually that older fish are being preferentially removed because they are more catchable in the population by anglers. And the remaining fish that are caught, so the ones that are actually caught that are older, are actually in much better condition. They're not as skinny as they were, say, in 2015 to 2018, and they're better fed. We track their diets, we look at what's in the stomachs of these fish, and they're more full of kokanee now. And that's a good thing. It means that predator to prey ratio is moving in the right direction because, as I said a couple slides previously, we want to basically get rainbow trout satiated so that there's more kokanee available to them than they can possibly even eat. Next slide. So bull trout are part of the equation as well. They are a predator on kokanee. And they haven't been monitored historically quite as well as rainbow trout, but we do have a time series of similar data. So the top right graph is some streams that we survey for spawner abundance. We can tell how abundant the spawners were by counting the nests that were made in the gravel. It gives us an index of how abundant the spawning population was. And we've seen since that peak time period in 2011, we saw a bit of an initial collapse followed by a bit of a rebound, actually. And then since then, another decline in bull trout abundance. A lot of our kind of test fishery data and public fishery data mirrors a lot what's going on in the Girard rainbow trout population as well. So that bottom left graph, we saw that in that peak time period around 2011, there was really high catch rates for bull trout, but that was maintained in 2015 onwards. So the kokanee collapsed, but the predators remained abundant. The predators that remained abundant were also small and they were skinny. But as of 2021, we've started to see a bit of a reversal in that trend. So like rainbow trout, the fishery catch has gone down. You can see that in our test fishery in the bottom right graph. We also see all the same kind of telltale signs that were in the Girard rainbow trout fishery of fishery effects of more and more fish being removed by anglers. So predators tend to be smaller and younger, and the remaining older fish that are present in the population are in better condition, they're better fed, and their stomachs are more full kokanee. So go on to the next slide.
Okay, so now we'll spend some time talking about the work that we've done to recover Kootenay Lake kokanee populations. So in response to the collapse of Kokanee and Kootenay Lake, we established a Kootenay Lake advisory team in 2015. Based on the recommendations for the team, the first suite of actions were implemented soon after. In 2016, an action plan was developed by the team, and we began implementing recommendations soon after that. The advisory team meets annually to review recent data and refine action plan implementation for that year. The team came up with two main levers for change. First is to add kokanee. We can increase kokanee production through programs like the Nutrient Restoration Program, which supplements nutrients into the lake and increases food supply for kokanee. Second is through stocking kokanee eggs and fry into Kootenay Lake. Second lever is to reduce predation on kokanee. We can reduce predation on kokanee immediately by reducing in-lake predator abundance, as well as reducing predation on kokanee in the future by reducing the number of juvenile predators that are produced. Now let's take a look at what actions we've implemented since 2015. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, one of the levers for change in Kootenay Lake is to increase kokanee production through stocking. So we've stocked approximately 24 million eggs and more than 1 million juvenile kokanee from genetically suitable sources annually into Kootenay Lake. It's mainly into the Meadow Creek spawning channel since 2015. And last fall, we stocked 1.1 million eggs into the Meadow Creek spawning channel. And we have plans again to stock a target of 5 million eggs into Meadow Creek this fall.
So just a little bit more on the stocking action. It's really context dependent on how important stocking is as a recovery action, depending on how many wild kokanee spawners there are in the population. So when kokanee are not abundant in the wild, stocking is an important lever. But when kokanee abundance is high, it really makes little difference to the total amount of fry you get the next year. So if you look at that graph on the bottom right, the blue shaded bars are each year the total amount of wild spawners multiplied, wild female spawners multiplied by the average amount of eggs in each female. So basically the total egg deposition in the wild spawning population. And in the orange bars on top of that are how much incrementally we were able to stock on top of that population into the Meadow Creek spawning channel. So you'll see in years where we get really low spawner returns like 2017, stocking makes a big difference. We're able to almost double the amount of egg supply in the lake and prop up that cohort, that weak spawning year class. There are other years where it doesn't make as much of a difference. Of course, there's limits to how many eggs we can source from outside sources of Kootenay Lake and bring them back in. So for example, in 2020, there were a sufficient amount of spawners such that if we stocked on top of that, it wouldn't make that much of a difference. And our trigger on that is 65,000 spawners. So if we have over that, we don't stock. If we have under that, we do stock. And it's a useful complementary action, particularly for propping up those very, very weak cohorts. But you could never drag kokanee out of the predator pit and solve this problem by stocking alone. People have tried it before in many other examples where ecosystems got into similar situations with predator pits. It never worked on its own. So there's some other local examples with other fish species and other populations where we saw stocking be a useful complementary action, part of a suite of tools to get the ecosystem back in balance. But it was never, there's never been an example we know of where stocking itself was able to be used as a tool alone. Let's go to the next slide.
Thanks, Will. So the Kootenay Lake nutrient restoration programs will continue to supplement nutrients lost to upstream dams and provide food for fish. This is done by adding limiting nutrients to promote phytoplankton or algae growth, which then feeds zooplankton, which then feed kokanee. So since the collapse, the predation release on zooplankton has occurred, as seen in the bottom plot, which shows Daphnia biomass over time. And Daphnia is the large-bodied zooplankton and the preferred food source to kokanee. In this era of collapse, it's important to have an increased food supply for kokanee. Why? So kokanee can spend less time foraging where they are vulnerable to predators, which will lead to higher survival. It also allows kokanee to grow faster to a size that they are no longer vulnerable to predators, also leading to higher survival. And it allows female kokanee to produce more eggs. For example, eggs per female now are about 3 times what kokanee used to produce before the collapse.
Right, so in terms of managing in-lake predation to promote kokanee survival and recovery, the ministry's implemented some important fishing regulation changes as well since 2015. Initially, a key one was to change the daily quota of kokanee from 15 per day to 0 to allow more kokanee to grow up and spawn. But also, we've implemented a series of more liberal angling regulations to allow anglers to harvest more bull trout and rainbow trout. So there have been increased daily quotas for both rainbow trout and bull trout on the main lake. We've allowed far more liberal fishing seasons and a daily quota for bull trout on the Duncan River. We went back to allowing barbed hooks on the main lake, so hopefully more hooked fish make it to the boat to be landed. We have opened the whole of Kootenay Lake all year long to fishing instead of having the north end closed seasonally. And we've increased the annual quota for larger Girard rainbows from 5 to 10 recently. So all of these changes in and of themselves give anglers the opportunity to be part of the solution in improving kokanee survival and recovery, but also harvest changes by anglers supplement and work in tandem with the other actions to all in tandem help kokanee recover. These reg changes that we have now here on Kootenay Lake are the most liberal harvest opportunity for wild trout and char in British Columbia. in most cases also in Western Canada and even the Pacific Northwest, especially for bull trout. Should kokanee recover soon, we will be reverting back to more conservative rigs over time as the situation, as befits the situation, but for the time being, Kootenay Lake will be a great opportunity to harvest trout and char. Ministries also conducted some with staff and contractors directed removals. So at the Duncan Dam plunge pool, removal of bull trout staging there, and also what we call kelp fences. After bull trout spawn in a river, they return to Kootenay Lake, and a fence and a trap can intercept those post-spawner bull trout called kelts. And we've run kelp fences to intercept them in a couple of years. In and of themselves, these are projects that can remove and did remove bull trout, but it's hard to be as effective with a couple small projects and ministry staff compared to the effectiveness of thousands of anglers and thousands of angler days harvesting on Kootenay Lake. So the former angler participation has been a key force.
Okay, so as a continuation of our actions for reducing predation on kokanee in the lake, we implemented the Kootenay Lake Angler Incentive Program for the last 2 years. So the Kootenay Lake Angler Incentive Program is a partner between the Ministry, the West Arm Outdoors Club, the BC Wildlife Federation, Freshwater Fisheries Society of BC, and Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation. Objective of the program is to incentivize anglers to harvest their rainbow trout and bull trout catch from Kootenay Lake. Anglers are encouraged to submit a rainbow trout or bull trout fish head to one of the 4 depots that are spread around the lake for ease of participating. These depots can be found at Woodbury Resort and Marina, Gill and Gift, Crawford Bay Market, and Windell. Please click on the link below the image for more information about the program. So there are several reasons why we implemented this program. First, the program reduces in-lake predator abundance, which has an immediate benefit to kokanee survival. This is probably why we saw the uptick in 1 to 2 kokanee survival that Tyler presented earlier on. This action has a high cost benefit relative to other immediate benefit actions implemented to date, like netting or removal via fences, like Jeff just talked about on the last slide. And finally, it engages anglers, the community, and brings businesses, local vendors, and increases local revenue. So the first program ran from June 2020 to the end of May 2021. Second program ran from June 2021 and will finish up at the end of May of this year. And then finally, we've proposed a 3rd year of the Kootenay Lake Angler Incentive Program, which would launch at the beginning of June of this year and run until the end of May in 2023. All right, so what are the results of the first and second program? So year 1 of the program was quite successful. In total, just under 11,000 heads were entered into the program. Our Kootenay Lake rainbow trout survey data indicated that the total harvest from the program almost doubled. That's shown on the graph on the right, the bar on the right-hand side. We've got rainbow trout in red and bull trout in orange. We saw an increase in harvest of about 85% for rainbow trout and 57% for bull trout, compared to the 2017 to 2019 average baseline harvest from the Kootenay Lake rainbow trout survey data. And that's shown on the bar on the left there in the graph. This means we almost doubled fishing mortality during the 2020 and 2021 season. This equates to approximately 14.9 tons of kokanee saved during the first year of the program. And surprisingly, this was mainly attributed to an increase of fishing effort of about 81% and a smaller 19% increase in harvest. So unfortunately, year 2 of the program has been less successful. To date, we've seen 3,903 fish entered into the program, which is only about 49% of the entries entered to date at this time last year. We've been hypothesizing why this may be, and figure it may be a combination of things, including possibly COVID effects. Of course, COVID is still very prominent in our lives, but anglers were more restricted to travel in year 1, so likely stayed home and fished instead. In year 1, we presented anglers with a single larger valued prize rather than 2 smaller valued prizes in year 2, and we believe that this could have impacted the success of the second program. Weather, the smoke was much worse this year, and it may have deterred some anglers from fishing. And I guess the point here is that some of these things were out of our control, and others may provide some good insight onto how a third program can be improved. So in conjunction with all of the other actions that we've implemented since 2015, we continue to monitor the fish populations in Kootenay Lake to inform our decisions and give us insight into the changes in the lake. So these include the implementation of our predator piscivore monitoring program, which was implemented in 2015 and is ongoing. This program involves a guide collecting fish samples on Kootenay Lake, like Will mentioned earlier. These samples will help us collect data on rainbow trout and bull trout catch data, diet, genetics, and age. And in addition to the implementation of the piscivore monitoring program in 2015, we also have several other long-term monitoring programs on Kootenay Lake that were implemented before 2015. These include monitoring Kokanee bull trout and rainbow trout through spawner counts, as well as Kokanee bull trout and rainbow trout juvenile counts. Pass it over to Matt.
Thanks, Molly. Yeah, so I guess I thought I'd just cover, well, what's next for 2022? What are the actions we're proposing to implement this year? And we've talked through some of them already in previous slides, but I guess just to step back, there's kind of there's lots of actions in our plan, but there's really a few key actions or components of those actions, and really that includes, one, increasing kokanee, and there's a few ways to do that, right? Stocking or food supply are kind of the 2 key ones, which we talked about, and food supply is maintained or increased through nutrient program delivery. And then the other side of that balance of predator and prey is decreasing predator pressure. And there's a few facets to that. So one that we have implemented progressively over the last 5 to 7 years are like changes to the current abundance. So that's things like the fences that we ran to remove bull trout. It includes the impact of anglers, but also that leveraged increase through the incentive program. And then the other facet of that is really around changing future abundance, so decreasing predator spawning stocks significantly enough that we reduce future supply. So they could help in 3 or 4 years, those sorts of actions, but they don't help today. But they're actions that they just take time, essentially. So those are the kind of key pieces around levers. So how are we proposing to implement those? I guess one, I'd say, so that these actions and annual implementation is really structured around the action plan. So there's triggers for action and definition of what some of those actions might be. So around kokanee stocking, as Molly said, our target this year, one, is to stock. So we make the decision around kokanee stocking based on the spawner forecast a year in advance, because by the time we know how many spawners are returning to streams, of course, it's too late to collect eggs elsewhere. So this is one of those that's already been triggered through the action plan guidance. And our target this year is around 5 million eggs, as Molly said. Around decreasing predator pressure, because we know from other examples where kokanee or populations have collapsed, this is one of the real key pillars. We're proposing this year to continue the Kootenay Lake Angler Incentive Program. That's really continuation of that work with the Outdoors Club, Western Outdoors Club, and the BC Wildlife Fed on not only continuation, but looking at ways of improving that program, because year 2 of it just did not perform as well as year 1. So I guess I'd say 1, we want to hear from anglers, like what limited your interest or participation in year 2 of that program. And Molly will talk a little bit later about the ways you can let us know, actually, because we'd like to know how to improve that program. The other proposed change in 2022 that would have immediate effect on kokanee is proposing to remove the daily limit of 2 rainbows over 50 centimeters. So that's a daily quota, but retain the 10 rainbows per year. And that would just mean that anglers would have to abide by our daily regional quota of 5 rainbows per day, and it would be any size. And the objective really around these progressive regulation changes, and this one as well, have been to monitor and adjust regulations so that catch rate for anglers is always lower than the potential harvest for angling rigs. So we don't want to limit potential to harvest. The additional lever that I talked about earlier is this recruitment reduction. So like a future reduction in Girard abundance or bull trout abundance by targeting spawning stock of these species and reducing it not to 0, but low enough that we see a change in recruitment. So lower number of juveniles to the lake in subsequent years. Our proposal for 2022 is to reduce Girard spawners to the target or trigger in our action plan of 50 to 100 spawners. So that's the threshold that we've reviewed since the action plan was finalized, and agree with the targets again in there, that there's really pretty low risk, very limited risk to reducing Girard spawners to that number. And our intent this year is to also put in place some best management practices around that action. And part of that is holding fish that we capture to ensure that we hit the spawner target on the spawning grounds. The proposed approach there is tangle netting, so intercepting spawners as they move from Kootenay Lake into the Duncan River between the middle of March and the end of April, which is about a 6-week migration period. And we're working with not only our advisory team, but also our Indigenous nation partners on implementation of that action. You saw in the graphs that Will talked to earlier around bull trout abundance, catch and spawner abundance has been declining over time pretty consistently on balance since 2012. We still have space there. We're above the 250 spawner trigger for conservation. So there's space to reduce bull trout further. But of course, they spawn in a whole range of systems around the lake, so it's harder to reduce recruitment. And the actions around daily quota changes and the incentive program and other actions that allow anglers to harvest more bull trout are actually having the intended effect there as well, maybe better than rainbow in lake abundance. So we're proposing not to focus on bull trout recruitment reduction, because it's kind of happening in some ways for us. But there is an opportunity on the Castle River if funding sufficient to reduce spawners there to 50, which is the conservation trigger for the Castle River. We're also proposing continuation of a few projects that have been ongoing. So the monitoring that Molly just talked about, it's super important for us to know and know what's going on in the lake, and it's pivotal in us making good decisions on the course of action on an annual basis. And as I said, the nutrient restoration program, it's super important for maintaining food for Kokanee, and the plan is to continue that program as well this year. And the only other one here, I guess, on the slide is really pilots to reduce future predator recruitment or predation pressure on Kokanee. So talked about a few options there, which we're proposing to implement this year. And the pilots are really just a few small scale projects to look at, are there any other options that we haven't considered to implement potentially in the future if we needed to push harder on predation pressure on Kokanee. Maybe that's it for me on this slide. I think, the intent here is say, look, we've got a bunch of actions to continue from previous years and some new ones as well that we think are important to implement.
Okay, so like Matt mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we do have an upcoming public meeting online on March 14th at 7 p.m. Pacific time. So you can access the meeting by clicking on the Zoom link below at the time of the meeting. And we'd like to give you a chance to be heard. So we've created an online survey, which can be accessed via the Survey Monkey link below. In the survey, you'll be given the opportunity to answer some questions about the Kootenay Lake fishery. You'll be given the opportunity to provide some input on how we can improve programs like the Angler Incentive Program, as well as submit comments. And in addition, you can enter any questions you might have about the presentation you've just watched or questions about Kootenay Lake, and we will answer those questions during the online public meeting on Monday. Finally, we've anticipated some of the questions that you might ask and have developed a presentation with some frequently asked questions and answers for Kootenay Lake. So please go to the Kootenay Lake Fisheries website in the link there to access the frequently asked questions presentation. And then lastly, we'd just like to acknowledge all of those who have contributed as well as funded the Kootenay Lake recovery efforts. As you can see, there are many, and it truly has been and continues to be a collaborative effort. References from our presentation there if you're interested, and that's all we've got for you today, folks. Thanks for listening in.